to Jemima Abu. Instead of like originally planned talking about HTML semantics, the session will be about you can't spell accessibility without CSS. Sorry for this change at short notice, but I bet you'll have fun nonetheless. And now I just hand over to Jemima. Have fun.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about accessibility with CSS. So I'm gonna just go ahead and share my screen, make sure everyone can see that. Okay, let me see if I can make this full view. I forgot how to make things full view. It's like F11, isn't it? F11? That is not what that does. Hold on. Okay. No. Just, oh, right, here it is. Perfect. So yeah, now that I figured that out, hi, like I said before, my name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about accessibility with CSS, or as my talk title says, you can't spell accessibility without CSS. It's funny because it's true. So to introduce myself, I am a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer, originally from Lagos, Nigeria, but I'm currently working at Kaunas in Lithuania at Telesoftis, a software solutions company. You can find me online anywhere and everywhere at Jemima Abu, that's 2 A's joined together. That is Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, pretty much everywhere online. So let's get right into it. Before we have to talk about website accessibility or accessibility with CSS, we have to talk about what is an accessible website. So simply put, an accessible website is a website that can be used by everyone. Now, a lot of times when people hear building accessible websites, they start thinking along lines of screen readers and, like visual helpers and things like that. And of course, those are very important parts of making sure your website is accessible, but also it's all the other things that you do that make your website accessible, because accessibility works in different ways. Because when we say everyone, we mean everyone regardless of their disability or their internet connection or the surroundings they happen to be in, just things like that. Accessibility can affect people that have auditory impairments or motor impairments, cognitive disabilities, visual disabilities, navigational disabilities. There are so many forms of there are so many different types of people out there that you just want to make sure that your site is being able to be used by all of them. Think of it as you have a building, right? You're an architect and you're trying to create a building. So obviously, the first thing you're going to do is you want to make sure people can get into that building. So you want a door or you want staircases if the building is going to be a slight high rise. And you know that people who use wheelchairs or people who have crutches and everything. So you want to make sure you have a ramp for them and you want to have railings for them that would provide support. You know that people in the building would need to see things. So you want to have enough windows for good lighting, or you need to have electrical outlets like they can have electrical lighting. So basically it's accessibility is just all the thought that goes into making sure your website can be used by everyone in every single circumstance. So how does CSS work with regards to accessibility? Basically, CSS benefits accessibility by separating document structure from presentation. Now, CSS is used in normal web design to make sure that your site looks pretty, yeah? You have a site and it's HTML, so it's really just text everywhere, and it's text in like, I think, what is it? Yeah, cascading styles. It's text in the order you put it on the page. But sometimes you want to arrange your text in a way that certain things are separated from certain things because it makes it easier for people to understand those things. When a page is made up of just HTML and it's just a lot of text or links or images on the screen, people can't really understand it. And that's why CSS comes into play to make sure that you have enough white space so it's not like you're overloading people with information. You want to make sure you have enough like what's the thing? Like visual landmarks, basically, so people can easily tell how they are navigating on a page. So things like that are how CSS is used to benefit accessibility. This was a tweet I saw online that I thought was very apt. Someone's like, yes, sure, but then there comes a certain point where accessibility becomes hard to integrate with the design. And the fact is, then the design sucks. If you are building a website or if you have a design in mind for your website and you're like, oh, but if I made this accessible, it would no longer work with the design. That's kind of it's like somebody saying, oh, I want to I want to build a car, right? And I want this car to be really pretty. I want this car to have like wings and so many cool things. But then if I put doors there, it's going to interfere with my design. If there are no doors on your car, how are people going to use the car? So it's not enough for your design to just look pretty or be aesthetically pleasing. It also has to be functional. If your design is not functional, if your design is not accessible, then it's just a bad design. So yeah, people ignore design that ignores people. If you're going around building things or creating things or designing things that doesn't take everyone into accountability, doesn't take all your users into accountability, then people are just not going to want to use that design. People are not going to appreciate all the work you put into it because it's useless to them. And that's pretty much the point of it. So now we've covered what accessibility is, how accessibility relates to CSS, and why accessibility is important in relation to CSS. So we're just going to get into like the ways we can write accessible CSS. So they're setting this thing. They're setting like guidelines and principles that follow how accessibility works. And these guidelines and principles are there in place to make sure that you know all the things you need to be doing to make sure your website's accessible. Like it has to be perceivable, it has to be understandable, it has to be operable, it has to be readable, things like that. So you want to make sure that you are putting all these things into place. So we're going to look at we're going to keep like the context of those guidelines in mind while we're looking at how to write accessible CSS. The first section we're going to be looking at is text and background contrast. In what's the word? With regards to accessibility for CSS, there are certain rules that come into play, and there are certain how do we put this? Like numbers that are used to justify those rules. When it comes to background contrast, for example, what we have is a ratio that lets you know how dark your text should be in comparison, or how light your text should be in comparison with the background. So things like a normal text, for example, anything like 18px and below, needs to have a ratio of 4.5 to 1 between the background, between the color of the text and then the background colors. While really large text, that's 18px and above, can have a 3 to 1 ratio. Basically, what it means is that the larger your text, the less you have to focus on contrast. But the smaller your text, the more important it is that you have a lot of contrast in that text. If you are, so yeah, this is the like definition of how that thing works. So the lightest you can get is same color text on same color background. So with this 1 to 1 here, I had to highlight it just to show the text there. But yeah, this would be saying if we had white text on a white background, or black text on a black background, or red text on a red background, or whatever. The text would, if the text has the same color as the same background, that means there is no difference between them, so they have the same ratio. But then the highest contrast ratio you can get is 21 to 1, meaning when you have white text on black background or black text on white background. So you can only get this ratio if you're using like white text on black background or vice versa. For example, if you're using a red text on a black background, you could have a good contrast ratio, but it just would not get up to 21. And if you're like me and you're interested in how they came up with this ratio and you want to know more about it, I did include a link to a very nice article on the calculation of this thing. There are so many like numbers and factors involved. So if you're a math nerd, you'll love that. I will be sharing the link to the slides at the end of the talk so you can have access to all the things I'm talking about, basically. So yeah. So this is what I was talking about when I said you need to have higher if you have lower content, then you can't have if you what am I saying? If sorry, I was trying to focus on the live discussion at the same time. So in case you guys have any questions or anything, I could easily just see it here. So yeah, if you have larger text on your background, you can use like lighter colors with it. You can get away with not using very dark colors. But if you have small fonts, especially when it comes to things like having paragraphs or having articles, it would be so weird if you went to a blog, or if you went to a blog or something, and the text was like gray and the background was white. So you have to be like, what is that? Why is it? Yeah, I think there was something that was going around a while ago. Like Google sent out this email talking about how like their products were great or something, but then the email had like light gray text and the background was like white. So it was nearly impossible to see. And then also the font weight was like 100. So it was like really thin lines. So it was something you'd have to actually zoom in to read. And I just thought that was funny because it's like, it's Google. But yeah, so the point is the rule of thumb is if you're going to have larger fonts, you can use lighter colors. If you're going to have smaller fonts, you can use darker colors. That's pretty much it. Um, yeah, so we can also use high contrast to distinguish elements. So sometimes you can have, let's say you have a button, right? And then let's say you're building a site and it's minimalist, so you don't want to have like too many colors. You don't want to be, you're cool, you just want to have, if your button is disabled, it's going to have like a light gray background, which is still aesthetically pleasing. And if it's enabled, it's just going to have a simple border, it vibes with your aesthetic. But there's somebody who has, let's say, a black and white filter set on their phone, or somebody who is colorblind, is not going to be able to tell what you were trying to pass across here, because these two things are going to look pretty much the same. It's not going to be obvious to them immediately that, oh, this one is disabled and this one is enabled, because all they're saying is a text, like text on a background, and that's it. They can't really distinguish between either of them. So one thing that we like to do is make sure that you are making it clear that something is disabled or something is active. You can use a higher contrast, you can use thicker fonts, you can maybe set one to have a border and one to not have a border. You can use embossed text, just kind of make it clear that doesn't just rely on colors, because not everyone is going to have colors enabled. So think about it like that. And then another thing is that we can also use CSS to convey information, saying that, oh, this can work and this can't work. So when you use things like user select none or pointer events none or cursor not allowed. So cursor not allowed is that one that shows you that little like not allowed circle. Pointer events none means that that thing cannot be interacted with as a pointer. So like you cannot click on it or anything. And user select means that they cannot select that element, you can't focus on that element, you can't like copy text from that element. So these are really good properties that we use in CSS to make sure that we're not just conveying things with the design, we're also conveying it with the functionality as well. But you should notice that pointer events none does cancel out cursor not allowed. So it's up to you to like decide which works. Because a lot of times we end up disabling buttons and we can set like cursor not allowed, but we forget to actually disable the on click function, for example. So you're saying the button is disabled, but people can still click it. So just, that's a thought. So yeah, this is how we usually set disabled things in CSS. And now we can go back to looking at contrasts and background and text contrast in the terms of images. When you have an image background, how do you ensure that the text you're putting on it has good contrast? So a lot of times when you're creating your site, you set your text and you can tell straight away that, oh yes, if I'm using a dark image, this is going to look good because I'm using white text and the image itself is dark. So it's clear, it shows. But now, what if you like publish that site and then later somebody in marketing or somebody in sales is like, oh, we have a new banner now, we want to change the image. Like that happens to me sometimes at work. Like we design a banner for something and then later they change the banner to use a different sort of media, like they change it to use a video. Like the most recent one was that we had this banner that was using one sort of video and then it had this overlay text. So the overlay text was like, it was transparent text, so when the video was playing, the text would be showing the background of the video, and then when you scroll up, the text goes up and then it shows the full video. So later we changed the video to be a video that had a lot of white space. But now the problem was because the place the text was on an overlay that was also a white background. So when the video was playing and it had white space in it, you just could not see the text at all. So that was a problem, and that was an accessibility problem, because now if someone comes to that page, there are going to be moments in that video where they're not going to be able to see the text. So these are things you need to keep in mind when you are creating text, when you're creating content, when you're using backgrounds. So now this has good contrast because it's light text on a dark background. But what about this? In this situation, what I'm seeing is nothing. And what happened here? What happened here is that the image didn't load. So what if something happened and they accidentally deleted it from the database, or the link was broken, or somebody was just using slow internet, so the image took a while before it loaded for them? If the image doesn't load and the only thing that provides contrast between your text and the background is that image, then that isn't accessible because now people can't quite tell what image you're trying to pass across. So I have a couple of methods that I ended up using for this. The first of them was to set a fallback for the background. So when you create your background, if you use the background shorthand property, you can pass in a color and an image URL. So this is basically the same thing as saying set background color to black and set background image to the URL of this image. What this means is that if the image hasn't loaded yet, the background is still going to have a dark background, and the color is still going to be visible because that is what you set it for, you know? So that is one of the methods to make sure that your image fallback is working. Another is, what if you use an image that has poor contrast with the text? So now you've already created your design and you've already set your text to color white, and now you have uploaded the image. But like I said, somebody changed it later, and now this new image has poor contrast with the text that you're using originally. How do we handle that? I think for me, the most common method and the easiest method really is just to always have an overlay. If you know you're going to always have light text on the background, you want to just always set an overlay. So regardless of what background is being used, the regardless of what background is being used, the overlay would be there and it would always make sure that the text is somewhat visible. But sometimes this could be like a design issue. Maybe the people that you're bringing the site for are like, oh no, we don't want this overlay. It makes our image look faded. We want to make sure the image is as clear as it can be. So just like maybe change the color of the text. Another thing you can do is, okay, so yeah, this is the CSS code for setting the overlay. So it's really easy. I always use like the pseudo selector, so I don't need to create a whole new div. If you use the before or the after pseudo selector, you can just set it's absolutely positioned and then just give it a background color and it'll be fine. So yeah, another thing we can do in the event that the person you're building the site for does not want an overlay, we can blend text with background. So what this does is that it changes the color of the text depending on the background image. So it's going to set the text to be an inverted color of the background image. And I'll show you the code later, so that will make sense. So you can see here that wherever, hold on, let me get the pointer. Wherever the image has darker lines, the text itself turns to white. So the same thing here and the same thing here. And this is all a CSS effect. We didn't do this with any design or anything. And how we can do that is by using the mix blend mode difference. So the difference is what sets this to be a different color than what the text was. You can see that I'm still using the white color. It's just blending in with the background and giving a different color than what is in the background. This doesn't really have, it does have like good, what's the word, support, but not in IE, and we always have to look out for IE, so I wouldn't use this in production, but this is just something to keep in mind in case that's what you're into. Another thing we can do is to invert text colors based on background. As we can see, this one doesn't work as well as the blend mode because where the text has black, it still is put on top of it. But basically what this does is that it would change your text color depending on whether you have a primarily dark or primarily light background. So how we do that is that I'm setting the background image of my text to the same image that is in the parent container. So this text now has a background image of this image here, right? And now I'm setting the color of the text to transparent. I'm using the background clip property to clip the background image to the text. This is a really cool CSS property that allows you display text using background images and not like have the background image at the back of the text. And I use the filter properties to invert the color, set it to grayscale. So grayscale makes sure that it's either white or black, and then increase the contrast so that it's really light or it's really dark depending on what I want. So yeah, this is another property that we can use. But like I said, personally, I do just prefer using the overlay. And if your client doesn't like that, we'll explain to them that accessibility is important. So you want to include the overlay there. And then, yeah, this is, or you know what, you could probably put a JS property that make sure that if the image has been loaded, then the overlay can vanish, something like that. Background clip has even less support than the mixed blend mode, so I definitely wouldn't use this in production either. But once again, it's just another option in case you need it. Speaking of options, we have the providing options aspect of CSS. So now sometimes you go to websites and they're in dark mode, you know, everything is dark and it looks very edgy and cool and hackerman friendly, you know. But then the problem is sometimes people are not in a suitable location to be looking at dark text. If you are standing outside, for example, whenever you're standing outside, dark mode sites are just really hard to read, especially if you're in direct sunlight, because it just makes your screen look darker. You can't really differentiate between text. Like I used to have this problem with my phone that if I reduce the brightness of my phone to the lowest amount, and then I went out in direct sunlight, I could not see my screen at all. Like I would not even be able to, like my screen would just be completely dim. I would not be able to see it at all. I thought it was like a bug or something, but nope, that's just like, that is how drastic the lowest brightness would get to. So I'd have to go back inside and increase the brightness before I could see when I went outside. So it's kind of the same thing with having dark modes on your site. Sometimes it's just not very visible to people. So what I usually do is if I'm creating a site that does have a dark mode option, I like to set the option to switch to light mode. You know, just provide like a higher contrast background option if you necessarily have to use dark mode. So this may not affect you if your site is in light mode, because light mode can be viewed everywhere. But then also it's possible that there are people who do have their default setting on dark mode, and you may want to like take them into account as well. So one way we could do that is to use the media prefers color scheme. So this is what we use to set to make sure that if somebody, let's say you're using a system and your system's default property is set to dark mode, for example, if I set prefers default color scheme, then it can easily just tell me that, oh, okay, I want to use this. the user prefers this color scheme, prefers a dark color scheme, so you can just use that instead of whatever color scheme you already have. So this is just an important part of accessibility is taking your users' needs into consideration, because it's one thing to build a site, but then are you building a site that people can kind of modify how they need to use it? That's another important thing. We'll be looking at more options of that later as we go on. So yeah, also if you've, honestly, like I feel like the thing that inspires me to write talks like this a lot is because, like, I know with this talk specifically, it was because I was having some odd bug with this site where I just could not, like, I couldn't zoom in. Yeah, that was the thing. I couldn't zoom in on the site, and I found that so weird because there were other sites I could zoom in on, but I couldn't zoom in on that site. And then I looked up why can't I zoom in on this site, and I found out what the reason was, and then I was like, that's so annoying. And now I have this whole talk. So you could let me know in the live discussion if you've had any, not necessarily like an accessibility problem, but just something annoying you found on the site. Like maybe you went to a site and they had like orange text on green background, or I see someone in discussion saying that Apple uses light gray text on white. So just let me know what your own accessibility like pet peeve is, and I think that'll be a fun discussion. And maybe I'll come up with more content for more slides later. Okay, and now since we have all those, we know now how to make sure that our contrast is high and to know what the background is. Now we can go into the tools for testing contrast. So the first is using Chrome DevTools. Chrome DevTools does have this really useful tool in their DevTools. If you click on text, you can kind of see this box here, which allows you to detect the contrast ratio and see if it's high enough. But this only works if the text has a color set and it also has a background color set. So that's how this works. But it just lets you know, and then you have these two lines here that it lets you kind of drag the, hold on. It has these two lines here where it lets you drag the pointers across so you can detect which line. I think this would be for the level AAA and this would be for the level AA. So it just lets you drag it across until you can get to like a suitable level of contrast ratio, and then you can move on. Another tool we can use is the WEBAIM contrast checker. This allows you just put in the foreground color and the background color, and it will tell you if the contrast ratio is good enough. That's pretty much it. All right. Yep, and so that's about it about using text and backgrounds and images. So now we're going to move on to the next part, the next section, which is using fonts and text and units. So this is everything relating to setting your font sizes, like your responsive widths and everything like that. So let's get into it. The first thing, and I feel like it's also very important, is to not override the browser's default size. So now, for me, like my parents on their phone, they have their font sizes set to like really large. You know, like how you go on their phone and then you can go to their messages and it looks like the messages are like ×3 of like how your messages usually are set. So now that's how this works. And then when you go to a website, you notice that they go to websites and sometimes the font is already increased by default because on their phone, they have set this font size to be really large. But then they go to some websites and the font is still tiny and then they have to start zooming in. How that works, the reason that happens is because in some websites, you end up overriding the browser's default font size. Browser default font sizes are usually set to, it can be browser specific, but it can also be device specific. So if somebody's using a device that insists that all their text has to be 36px, most browsers will take that into consideration and make sure that you are displaying text of at least 36px. But then if you have already overridden the browser's default font size, and what I mean by overriding it is setting a new absolute unit. So what I have done here is set a font size of an absolute unit, 14px. That means all over my page, everything is going to be 14px, regardless of whether the browser has a higher size or this device has a higher size. To avoid doing that, instead of setting sizes in absolute units, we can use relative units. Relative units are things that are dependent on already existing values, like already existing font sizes or device view height or viewports, things like that. So setting a font size to 100% basically means that the font size you're going to end up with is going to be 100% of whatever is already set on the browser. So you're not necessarily overriding the browser. Let's say you want a font size that is slightly smaller than what the browser has. You can do 75%, or you can do 60%, or just you can set your font size to a relative unit. And that relative unit that's commonly used is EM. So 1 EM is really equals to 16px, but it could also be equals to whatever default size is set on the browser. So if I set mine to 0.625 AM, so I just know that I'm getting like 625 relative value of what that default browser font size is. So basically that's a useful way of making sure that you're not taking away the option of increasing text for your users. So like I said before, using relative units for font sizes. So absolute units are things like px and pt. Px and pt are set to pixels and points. They're not going to increase or reduce regardless of what the screen is or anything. I also put these here, even though these are not absolute units, they are relative units, because this is view height, view width, and view max or view min. The reason I put them there is because I do not think that you should use them to set your default font size, because screens change rapidly, you know, and then it's really hard to calibrate font to screens, because you can end up on like a really large TV and your font is just going to end up being huge, or you could end up on like a really small Apple Watch or something, and your font is going to end up being ridiculously tiny. So personally, I do use view heights and view width to calculate, to kind of calculate my font size, in that I would probably say set fonts to like calc 1.25 RAM plus 10 vmin, for example. So I can always make sure that my font gets like a little extra added space depending on what on how large or how small the screen is. But then I also make sure that it has that base size, like 1.25 RAM. So that's just one way of using it. So, and then units that are commonly used, or that should be commonly used for setting font sizes, should be like EM, REM. Percentage is like kind of iffy depending on the context. I would also use percentage in calcs, and I would not set a width to a percentage exactly for text, but it could also be used. And CH. CH is a really cool property that allows you set font sizes according to characters and not according to the text itself. What that means is I can say I want the width of my paragraph to be 20 characters long. And that means no matter how large or how small my text is, the width of that paragraph will always be only 20 characters. I think that's a really cool property, and we'll talk about that more later. But yeah, I just brought it up now. And then not justifying text in large paragraphs. I put this on here because I am guilty of it, because a lot of times I end up creating blogs or articles and I'm like, oh, but it looks so much prettier when it's justified, because like it blends with the image and everything is on one straight line. The problem with that is that there are people who do not find it easy to read large blocks of text, people who do not find it easy to like to concentrate on large blocks of text when they have things like irregularities in between them. And that is what text align justified does. It creates things like irregular spaces and breaking up words in odd ways that you may not have intended. And just like, it's weird to read. It looks good, but it's weird to read. And like we said, design should not, let's see. Design should not just be pretty, it should also be functional. So you want to make sure that the design you're creating is functional, and making it functional means not necessarily keeping it justified. You could just use your regular left align, or if you do RTL, direction then right aligned, and that'll be fine. And then keeping paragraph width narrow within 55 to 65 characters. This is something I also learned when I was looking up more details for this talk, and I realized that a lot of times I create articles and I don't really keep in mind how long my paragraphs run on for. You know how sometimes in English you end up having like a run on sentence and it just seems like the sentence keeps going, and by the time you reach the end of the sentence you forgot what the beginning of the sentence was saying? That's kind of the same thing with setting like really wide paragraphs. People are going to end up finding it really hard to read what is in that. When I see paragraphs like this, it kind of makes me not want to read it already, because it just looks like everything is just going on. And by the time I get to the end of the line, I've forgotten what line I'm on, or I have to start again from the beginning. So personally, I don't like this. A solution to that is setting a narrow width for your paragraph. And that's where this character thing I was talking about comes into play. So if you set a narrow width, or if you set a max width for your paragraph, that means your paragraph is always going to be within this size. It can be less than that size if the screen is resized, but no matter how wide the screen is, your paragraph is always going to be within 55 characters, depending on the property you set it to. So if we're doing that in CSS, all we need to do is just target our P elements and give it a max width of 65 characters. This means that our element is always going to have 65 characters regardless of how wide the screen is. Well, our element is always going to be max 65 characters. If the screen is reduced, it can go to less than 65 characters, which is not such a problem. And then applying text effects with styles and not content. This was that thing I included because I saw it somewhere. It's like, if you're trying to create, let's say you're trying to do fancy text, it may not be something like what I'm doing here is just like text that is spaced out. It could be text that is curved or text that forms an infinity sign or something. If you're going to do effects like that, make sure you're styling it as a style and not with the content, because let's say someone is using a screen reader, for example. What they're going to read here is HELLO. You're not going to read hello. And then what if it's like a really long line you have, or a really long sentence, but then because you wanted to put spaces in between them, a screen reader is not going to read that out as a sentence. It's going to read it out as letters with spaces in between them. So a lot of times when you are trying to apply effects to text, make sure that you're styling the effects, because screen readers would not take the style into consideration. It will still read that as the content that you passed into the HTML. But then make sure that, or if you can't really do that, then just use an SVG, because screen reader wouldn't read that either. Unless it's, but if you use an SVG and it's content that has to be read, then you can have like a fallback HTML content, and you can set the SVG's attributes to hidden or something. So the screen reader would actually read it out, but the SVG can still be displayed for people who are using your site visually. So yeah, that's that. And then avoiding using semantics for styling. This is something I have been guilty of. A lot of times when we want to have a larger header on our page, or we want to have something that looks like bold and strong, we end up using like the semantic elements. So if let's say I want to have like a larger header somewhere in my page, so I'm like, oh, I can just put this in a H3 element. So it's just going to end up having bold font, and it's going to be larger than everything else. The problem is that if that header, if that thing you're styling is not actually a header, or it's not something that actually fits the semantic definition, they're just making it harder for people who rely on, like, let's say headers for like outlines of your page, for example, because every header on your page serves as, think of it as having a table of contents. You know, when you go to, like, when you open a book and you can see table of contents, so you can just easily go to the page. It's kind of the same thing with having headers. Headers serve as outlines for your page, so you can easily tell what section this is and what subsection and what subsection. So when you end up having headers that you're using for styling and not to actually pass across the information of being a heading, then you are breaking up the functionality of that semantic element. The best thing to do is to just style it using, CSS. So that's why we have all these ones here. I put this here because I used to be really guilty of that. Like, I would want something on my page and I just like throw it in the semantic elements, because I really didn't want to have to go to CSS and create a whole new property for it, because that was stress. But yeah, this is something to keep in mind. And then, yeah, this was the one I was complaining about earlier. Allow your users to control the zoom of the page. Like, this isn't even a CSS problem. I was just so miffed about it that I had to put it here. So what that means is there's a HTML property that actually prevents your users from being able to zoom in on the page. So if I set my content to a maximum scale of 1 and user scalable no, that means my users cannot zoom in on that page. Like, if you're using your phone, you cannot, like, that thing you do on your phone where you can kind of hold it and like stretch the screen. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, I was trying to show the live discussion. Like, if you hold it like this, it like kind of increases or reduces the screen. Yeah, so it's possible to stop that by setting a meta content with user scalable no. But that's not nice, because sometimes people just want to be able to zoom in on text or something, because sometimes it's just really hard to read certain texts that are on pages. So instead of doing your whole maximum scale to 1 and user scalable no, just like use your regular viewports for content width and initial scale and leave it like that. If the user wants to zoom in, then that's fine. And if zooming in breaks your site, well, fix it then. you know? And then, yeah, this was something I meant to include after the whole semantic thing. I guess I mixed up the layouts. But yeah, CSS can influence screen readers, but this was something I read in someone's article. It didn't actually happen for me, but then again, I do not have access to all forms of screen readers out there. So it's possible that it does. And like, one of the principles of accessibility is to be robust, so you want to make sure that it works for all devices, not just the device you're using. So that's why I included this there. It was in a Ben Mayer's article, and he basically said that when he used the voiceover, I think voiceover is a screen reader for Safari or something, or on Mac, when he used that on a capitalized, it was a button, and he used the CSS text transform property capitalized. So the button was add, and then he changed it to add in capital letters, but the voiceover read it out as ADD, which is interesting because a lot of times you wouldn't expect CSS to change how voiceovers work. But then again, it will also be like an AI thing, and who knows how every device works. But yeah, it is something to keep in mind that sometimes things like this could happen. Yeah, so I did include the link to the article here in case you want to go read up on that some more, and you can see that. So that's about that for CSS fonts, text, and units. So now we can move on to the CSS order and hierarchy of elements. So now, because a lot of times CSS is used to rearrange how content is laid out on the page, sometimes we just like have fun with it. It's like, oh, you've written your HTML in this way, but then CSS, I want everything to be upside down. So I'm going to change the whole layout of my page using only CSS. We're going to see why that's a problem. So first of all, the first thing I like to do is to make sure that you're grouping related content, especially when it comes to things like forms and labels. So sometimes you end up having this is not really like an accessibility problem as much as an, let's say, user experience problem, because sometimes when I am filling out forms, like I had to fill out, there was this form we had to fill out in school, and it was like we had to fill it out every semester basically, and then it would have all the labels on the left side and it would have all the input forms on the right side, and then it was always so hard for me to remember, because once you start typing, the placeholder goes away, so it always be hard for me to remember what I was actually filling out, and I'd have to look to the left and I have to like kind of trace it to make sure it's on the same line. And I just found that very annoying. So that's actually why I included that here. So for me, it's easier, or I think it makes more sense if you are grouping your related content together. So make sure your labels are above your input elements and make sure you have these labels. It's not enough to just include the placeholder, because once somebody starts typing, the placeholder goes away and then they may not remember what they were typing at the end. So put labels directly on top of input so that it's clear what is linked to what, and then give it enough space. So it's not like you have another label starting immediately below the input. Give it enough space, arrange it in a way that it's easy to read. Yeah. So that's what I mean by grouping related content. And that thing is to arrange content logically. So now, a lot of times in CSS, we do this thing where we can rearrange the order of elements. I do know I've had to do it in a couple of designs at work, because in desktop view, they want it to look one way, and in mobile view, they want it to look another way. So now when you place content on a page using HTML, tabbing through that page, it will tab through in the order that the content is placed. So what I have here is 9 elements that I have placed using HTML, and now I'm tabbing through using CSS, and you can see that it tabs through in the order we expect it to tab through. If I was building an RTL website, it would start from the right and it would tab through to the left. But then when I end up, if I reorder this using CSS, for example, I change this using, like, let's say it's a grid item, and now I want to change the order. It's a flex item, and I want to give it a different order. So now I end up having this, which I have reordered logically with CSS. I have reordered visually with CSS, but logically it doesn't make any sense, because the screen is still going to tab through in the order it appears in HTML. So now this thing looks broken. So you can see that it is tabbing from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but because I rearranged all these things, to the user, it just looks like it's going across the screen like in a crazy manner. It doesn't make any sense. So this is how reordering visually doesn't actually change the logical order of things. So an easy way to combat that, it would be to maybe set a different tab index on the things that you have reordered. So if you have changed the order of your elements, you can also update the tab index in HTML. So if you do this, it would tab through in the order that it does appear in CSS. But I really don't like messing with tab indexes, because it's like when you start putting too many Z indexes on the page, it's like at some point you're just going to get tired, So just try and use it like in the way that it's already intended to be used, which is placing logically with HTML, not CSS. If you need to rearrange something, or if you want something to appear in a certain manner, you can just place it in that manner using HTML. So another example of that is when we're dealing with like menus and headers, for example. For some reason, sometimes people end up creating headers and then putting nav elements below it, because they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, my nav element is going to be sticky, so I just want it to be on top of the page. If I put my header below my nav and I position my nav absolutely with CSS, it's going to look like the nav is on top. But if somebody tabs into that page, they're going to end up tabbing to the header first, and then they're going to tab the nav after the header. So now this could be a useful way if you want to make sure that people always, let's say you have a search button or something, I want to make sure that people always tab to it first. So you could actually just put that there first with HTML, but then it's kind of annoying, because I kind of expect things to tab in the order they appear on the page, not that I'm jumping about the page because you wanted to rearrange it with HTML. So if you're going to put something, if you want something to appear in a certain order on your page, then just put it there in HTML, So that's another option. And then avoid breaking content. This is like a very, very specific CSS thing, because I don't even think anybody works with columns anymore, but just in the event that you do, if you are going to have, let's say you have content on your page that runs over to the next part of the page, you want to make sure that it's going to appear in a way that it's not broken up. You're not breaking the content and people can still understand what they're reading. So here I'm preventing it from like continuing on to the next line, you know? So all the contents that are related to each other would be grouped together, and if it's not enough space for that content, it would just start on a new part of the page. This is like very specific. Like I said, it only works for CSS columns, but it's something to keep in mind. And then we have discussed the order and the font and everything. We're going to move on to images, but specifically IMG versus background image. I know when I first started with HTML and CSS, for me, I would just use background image whenever I wanted to have that like whole background image cover. Like I didn't even like using image at all because I always found it very hard to style images because like you need them to be, you need that to be like an exact width or height, or if you style the width or height differently, then you end up having a skewed image. It's great because now you can use the object fit property, but before that, I didn't know about that. I was like, oh, I can just use background image and set contain, and it wouldn't matter. But the problem with that is that image and background image have different uses, and they're not really interchangeable. The first is that background image serves as content. If you have image on a page that is meant to convey information and not just be a design element, then that has to be the IMG tag because that's what's going to enable your. Because sometimes you have images as links, for example. So what I have here is my there's like a danger image here. What this is doing is that it's conveying a warning, you know. So I could set this as content and then set alt like danger sign or red triangle with black exclamation mark or whatever. This is conveying information of the books that have been gathered. So I could set this image here and then give it an alt of 4 books with titles. Black matter images includes the colors red, blue, yellow, and orange on a wooden background, stuff like that. So basically, if your image is meant to set, I should do. It'd be really useful if I did another one for how to actually write good alt text for images, because I know a lot of times, well, I still have problems with it because sometimes it's just like, how do I describe the alt text of this image? Because that's what the screen reader is going to read out. How do I describe this in a way that is useful but doesn't like contain unnecessary information? You know, like sometimes you have a logo and then you just put like company logo and then you're like, is that useful, or should I actually describe what the company should? I be like 2 circles on top of a third circle with a rectangle? You know, it's just like alt text is, it's confusing to write sometimes. But yeah, so you can have your images here and you want to make sure they are set as content and then make sure they are easy to read and people can understand the purpose of that image. Background image is for design. If you have any image on the screen that doesn't do anything other than be a design, this, for example, I mean, this could also be content, but I think this did serve more as a design. And this, something like having a banner image or something, it's not something that people need to read out. It's not something that is conveying any form of information or improving any information that's already existing. So you can set it as background image because screen readers don't actually need to read it out. So yeah, that's that. Yeah, so cool. That was that for images. It was a really quick slide actually. And then we have outlines. Outlines were my biggest CSS pet peeve because I cannot count the number of times I have built a website and designer was like, oh, when we click it, there's this ugly blue button on it. Can we remove that? And I have to be like, no, the button kind of has to be there. But then most times we end up finding like a fallback for it. I'm like, okay, we just need something to show that that element is currently active or that that element is currently being tabbed through. Like not button, sorry, border, like that light blue border, or well, the border changes color depending on your system's default setting, but most times it's like a light blue border. So yeah, outlines. Sometimes when I first started doing web design, I would just be so tired of outlines. I'd be like, I don't even know why this thing is here, and I would just target all elements and set outline to none. So you never want to do that because that's really bad. So my what I found as a suitable solution is that it's not necessary that you keep outlines there, but you should include some form of what's the word I'm looking for? Like visual representation of when somebody is on an active element, basically. And then I found that it's also better to only include it in the focus and hover styles because those are the main styles that you have a problem with on outlines. I don't know where else an outline can show up, but I think it is useful that you don't target all the parts of the element. You don't remove the outline on all the parts of the element. You only remove it on when the element is hovered on or is focused on. So what I'm doing here is that I'm giving my element a different background color and a different border when it has been hovered or focused on, and then I remove the outline property. So this way the user is still clear. So sometimes when it's like, if it's an image, for example, sometimes I can like do a scale, maybe just like increases the size a little if the element is focused on, or it gets a darker border, or it gets a lighter background, or just something that makes it clear to users that this element is the one in focus right now. And then you can remove the outline property because nobody will sue you for that. Because fun fact, people have been sued for not having like easily navigatable outlines on their page. So that's something to keep in mind. So yeah, and then another option is having fallback for your properties. Fallback for your properties are, it's like cross-browser compatibility. You know, you have a property and you want to make sure that regardless of what browser or what device that thing is being used in, it does have the proper, it kind of displays how you want it to display. So I was speaking about custom properties here. Custom properties are like your CSS vars, for example. So it's possible that you'll be using it's possible you could be using a browser that does not support CSS variables. So what you want to do is that, you know, because CSS works in a cascading manner and it has all those like specificity things. So if you put one color, if you put one property first, the next property is going to override the property that came before it. But then if that next property is not supported, the first property you included would be the one that's actually run. So what I'm doing here is I set a first background property of black, and then I set my var property below it. So if this is in a browser that supports vars, this first background property will be cancelled out and I wouldn't have a problem. If it's in a browser that does not support vars, then this one wouldn't apply at all and this one would still run. So either way, we'll make sure that I kind of have a color there that is working. And that one for fallback properties, for custom properties, is if the variable is not defined. So let's say here I set a var bg color, but instead of writing color with an O, I wrote it with a U, which was what I was meant to do here. I write it with a U, but then in my root, I had defined it with an O. What this means is that this property technically does not exist. But now I can set a fallback property here so that even if they don't find this property, it would actually just pass in this fallback property instead. So this is also really useful for instances where your root variables don't load or where you have the wrong root variable included. And then using browser prefixes. When I used to find it really annoying to use browser prefixes every time I had to write a transition or something, because I had to be like, transition, all transition, MS transition, mouse, WebKit. And I was like, what is the point of doing all this? But luckily I work with SAS and then I use some, and Tailwind as well. And then they're just really useful for like you just need to write the property itself and then they will add all the necessary prefixes for you, which I find very useful. But the reason for having these prefixes is that sometimes you're just on browsers that don't support this thing. If I was using Mozilla, then Mozilla would use the mouse transition. If I was using I actually don't know what MS and O is for. Like I know one of them is for Safari and one of them is for like I think Internet Explorer. Maybe it's MS that's for Internet Explorer because like MS is Microsoft in it, and then O is Safari because oh well, why not? So anyway, yeah, the point is that the prefixes are for the specific browsers that they're related to make sure that these properties are going to be able to be used by the browser. For example, here in Chrome, Chrome does support transition and WebKit transition. So you can see that the reason WebKit transition is in red is because it has been overridden by transition. And that's another important thing. You want to write it in the order of which is going to be overridden. That's why we put all the prefixes first and then we put the actual property below it. Because if any of these properties work, they will be displayed. But then if the transition property also works, it will override whatever property has been displayed. So you can see here that if I uncheck transition, then the WebKit transition property is still be able to be displayed because that's how the browser prefix works. And then speaking of fallbacks, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could have a fallback for our for Opera? Thank you. Well, Safari. Anyway, so yes, if you have fallbacks for properties, what if you have fallbacks for I keep on forgetting Opera is a browser. What if you have fallbacks for images as well? But I felt like this would not be very useful because most times if one image doesn't load, it's probably because something is wrong with your internet connection or what database is being called from. So basically, let's say here we have our image and we have our alt and we are setting the source to be something. But then what do we want a fallback in the event that the source cannot be displayed or the source of that image is not displayed? So we can set an image source. Let's say the image doesn't have any source. That means the alt property will be displayed. But then what if we had a fallback of another image or we had a fallback of a background color? So what that means is that even if that image is not displayed, you can see here that this image isn't displayed because the alt tag is being displayed. But then it displays like whatever image you have set as a fallback, or it will display whatever background color you set here. I'm just thinking, in the event of, but that's really just for a visual thing. And I can't really think of an event where I would need that. It's just when I was writing this, I was like, oh, that'd be cool. And then I included it here. So yeah, that is another possibility. And then when it comes to testing design accessibility, these are certain tools we can use. There's the Lighthouse cool. There's the Lighthouse tool in Chrome that allows you kind of generate an audit report on your accessibility, and it shows you all the things that you're doing right, or that the things that could be fixed, or things you can manually test yourself. Things like the contrast, if you're using all your ARIA properties correctly, if links have a discernible name, if images have like suitable alt tags. So it's really useful for that. Chromevox is a screen reader tool in Chrome that allows you to navigate through your site using the screen reader. So it's just a really helpful way of helping you understand if the content that you're displaying on your site makes sense if you're not looking at it, or if you're hearing it being read out to you. There's also the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, which can be an extension in Chrome where you can go to their website and you just enter the URL of your site, and it gives you a very nice breakdown of your site structures and content and design and everything. And then finally, you can manually manipulate the design. Something I like to do is set like an opacity of 0 on your body tag, or just set like a fixed background color on your body tag, and then tab through your page using like a screen reader, or just tab through your page and see if you're able to actually tell what part of the page you're on, even though you can't see what part of the page you're on. And see if you're able to tell if the content is being read out in the way that you intended for it to be read. So things like that. It's just a really easy way of making sure that all the parts of the site you're building are able to, how do I put this? If all the sites of the parts you're using are able to be read out properly. So yeah, that's about it for the tools. I do have links to the slides, which I said I would give earlier. So if you want the slides, you can just go to my website, jemimaabu.com/slides/CSS accessibility. If you cannot remember this part, all you need to do is just go to jemimaabu.com/slides, and I do have an index for all the slides to my previous talks, and you can view that here. This is the code that I wrote for all the examples and demos we had in the talk, so you can go view them here as well, and then just kind of see how that works basically. I do have, nope, did not mean to click that. Yeah, I do have links to more resources. These are articles I found really useful while building this. There was the CSS access. Why the words get jumbled up in my mouth? There was the CSS accessibility article, which I found useful. There was also writing CSS with accessibility in mind by Manuel. This is really cool. It's both an article and a talk he has given, so you can either read the article or watch the talk he gave. Then there's the web accessibility checklist. I do find checklists important personally when I'm building sites, because sometimes you just forget what thing needs to be done there, and then it's just an easy way of kind of pinpointing how to fix your site before you even need to go test it. So it'll be things like, oh, are you discerning when content is being focused on, or are you contrasting between text and images properly, or just like useful points to make sure that you are building your site with accessibility in mind before you even need to get to the testing stage. There's also this really cool article on accessible web typography. I included this because I found it really useful, because I did not approach web when I got into web dev, it wasn't from like a design perspective. So I don't know a lot of like design concepts, things like typography or white space or things like that. I just know how to build sites. But I found it useful because sometimes it is important. This was also where I found the thing with making sure that your paragraph width is narrow, because I knew that I didn't like it when paragraphs were long, but I didn't actually know what the problem was. And this helped me realize that, oh, it's because it's like too wide and it makes it hard for me to read it out. There's also CSS media queries for accessibility. So the things like the whole prefers color scheme dark and stuff. So these are all useful articles, and you can definitely read them up, and they do provide really more useful insights into accessibility with CSS. And then, yeah, so that's about it for me. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And I'm sorry it wasn't the HTML talk. It's just that I totally blanked on that one and I already had this one done. So yeah, but thank you once again for listening. If you do have any questions, I will be in the live discussion for like, I think I have like 7 minutes left. So I'll be in the live discussion for about 7 minutes. You could also ask me on Twitter at Jemima Abu. You could just send me a message there. Or you could reach out to me on LinkedIn. You know, if you want to give me feedback on my talk as well, I'm always very interested in that. Always looking for how to improve stuff. You could also fill out the contact form on my website, jemimaabu.com, and I would love to take any questions or messages or comments that you have. So thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.
Thank you, Jemima. Thank you very much. It was fun listening to you. Of course, very interesting. Well, we are a bit over time, so I'd say, as you offered, you be in the chat, and I guess there's a lot of discussion coming to you. To our viewers, thank you for watching. I see you after lunch. And thank you again, Jemima, for your funny talk. See you. Bye.